We're going to continue tonight our Family Talk series, which is really a series of counseling sessions more than it would be teaching or even preaching. It's definitely a counseling approach, maybe with a little more passion, but that's the goal. At least my goal is to provide some biblical counsel to help you in relationships, in the home in particular, but these can be applied to any relationship, friendship, and relationships with coworkers, just any type of personal dealings, but hopefully we'll keep you out of the office to get counseling if you're here and can apply these truths. Now, if you know me personally well enough, you know that I have a habit of asking questions. I guess I didn't know it, but people think I ask a lot of questions, and I'm sure that has a lot to do with my genetic social makeup. I'm a lot like my father, and so we are just that way. But I also have made it it's been an intent of mine because of my calling. I ask questions when dealing with people because I think it's crucial to any ministry. If I'm going to counsel someone, if I'm going to potentially give you any advice, well, I can't afford to assume too much. And so asking questions limits assumptions. Assuming anything, but assuming too much is very dangerous. And in particular, assuming the worst in anyone is a very risky move to make. I think this issue of assumptions is well known. We all know the saying that goes along with assuming. But there are a lot of thoughts out there on assumption, and I don't normally do this, but I grabbed just a number of thoughts from other people and wanted to share them with you before we get into the passage. But someone once said, assess before you assume. Assess before you assume. That's a very wise and simple statement. Someone else said this, we live our lives supposing things are as they appear to be, when that is almost never the case. Very true. Someone else said, assumption is one dreadful and incurable disease which sticks to the soul and wiggles across the skin. Assumptions are dangerous things to make, someone once said. And like all dangerous things to make, bombs, for instance, if you make even the tiniest mistake, you can find yourself in terrible trouble. It's tough when a real tall, big guy comes into the church to do so quietly. Well, welcome to church tonight, Brother Sauer. It's good to see you. You survived your morning services?
I did.
Perfect. Would you like to, at the end? You're assuming they'll all be awake by then, so you'll wake them up? All right, at the end of this. Good to see you, Gary. Someone else said this, the explanation requiring the fewest assumptions is most likely to be correct. The explanation requiring the fewest assumptions is most likely to be correct. Again, very, very true. This is what someone said, a little deeper here, so listen very carefully and soak it in. This person said, if others tell us something, we make assumptions. If they don't tell us something, we make assumptions to fulfill our need to know and to replace the need to communicate. Even if we hear something and we don't understand, we make assumptions about what it means and then believe the assumption. We make all sorts of assumptions because we don't have the courage to ask questions. Very, very true. Someone said our assumptions are the windows of the world. We need to scrub them off once in a while or the light won't come in. And then finally I discovered these wise words. Someone said, don't build roadblocks out of assumptions. We all do it. It's a part of life. We have to make some level of assumptions because we don't know all of the answers. We never could know all the answers, and so we do make assumptions. We do it on varying degrees, and we make assumptions for various reasons. But assuming too much, in fact, assuming much at all, is dangerous. And assuming the worst in particular is very dangerous. It's very dangerous across the board, but when we do it with our supporters, of our allies, of our friends, of our spouses, of our children, of our family members, it is an absolute problem for those relationships. So we're going to look at 2 Samuel 10. That's all we're doing tonight. Going to be very straightforward, very simple. We're going to look at the entire chapter and make 4 observations about assuming the worst. Let's start in verse 1. The Bible says, "And it came to pass after this," and that's a reference to chapter 9. What happens in chapter 9 does have some bearing on chapter 10. In chapter 9, David says, I've got to find somebody in the house of Saul to show kindness to. Because if you recall, the house of Saul, the house of David were at odds. David wisely ran from Saul. Saul's career as a king was ended early based on God's judgment. David eventually would assume the throne. Still some friction in the kingdom regarding Saul and David. David wisely says, listen, Saul gave me a shot at my career anyways. If it wasn't for Saul, I would have never been on the field of battle in the valley of Elah. I love this man. In particular, I love his son, Jonathan. I owe his family something. And so the whole chapter of chapter 9 is dedicated to him doing a good thing for Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. And that does play into this as we go forward. Think about that in light of what we're going to read tonight. The mindset of David is to be a blessing. Usually the mindset of David is to lop heads off and to help the kingdom of Israel. But in chapter 9 and chapter 10 of this book, he's trying to be a blessing. When it's not reciprocated, that doesn't sit well with him. So verse number 1, "And it came to pass after this that the king of the children of Ammon died, and Hanun his son reigned in his stead. Then said David, I will show kindness unto Hanun the son of Nahash, as his father showed kindness unto me." I just want to hit the pause button real quick and tell you we don't know what that alliance looked like. We don't know the kindness that Hanun showed to David. It's not recorded in Scripture, but evidently Hanun, this king of the Ammonites, did something nice for David, the king of Israel, who were typically enemies. And so David wanted to return the favor upon the death of Hanun's father. And so it said here in verse number 2 that David sent to comfort him by the hand of his servants for his father. And David's servants came into the land of the children of Ammon, and the princes of the children of Ammon said unto Hanun their lord, Thinkest thou that David doth honor thy father, that he hath sent comforters unto thee? Hath not David rather sent his servants unto thee to search the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it? This chapter is going to teach us that when we allow ourselves to draw conclusions before getting the facts, we will be severely handicapped in the area of relationship building and relationship preserving. When we allow ourselves to draw negative conclusions before getting all of the facts, we will make mistakes that will come back and hurt us. 4 things about assuming the worst. Number 1, assuming the worst interprets disastrously. In general, assuming anything is the process of making an educated guess about something or someone. And the danger of assuming is that you're assigning a motive to someone without knowing that motive. We can never know someone else's motives because those are buried in the hearts of people. We don't have the eyes of God to see inside the heart. So we have to gauge based on what we see, what we hear, what we sense is the motive of someone else. And we have to do that throughout life. The danger is, though, when you make that decision, we've got to do that with as much information as possible because we run the risk of causing a lot of problems. The text here doesn't reveal any investigation on the part of the Ammonites. It doesn't reveal any inquiry. It doesn't reveal that the princes of the children of Ammon got together with David's servants and grilled them and asked questions. Why are you here? What are you doing? And tried to find out the answer. What we see here is that they assumed right from the get-go. As soon as they saw the servants of David, they made assumptions and they assumed the worst. They assigned an evil motive where there was none. And when we assume the worst in people, we interpret differences in people disastrously. Why did the children of Ammon look at the servants of David and decide they were there to overthrow the city, to spy it out? Well, I think for 2 reasons. Number 1, they were a very defensive people. Remember, the posture of the Middle East is, it's like this. They're not peacemaking people because there's a lot of passion, a lot of emotion, a lot of history in a small part of the world. The Ammonites bordered the Israelites, and so they were neighbors who had a history rich in blood. And so when the Ammonites see Israelites, their first instinct is to be defensive, to make sure they're not going to be harmed. The second reason that the Ammonites made this assumption was because they were a very different people. When David's men arrived on the scene in Ammon, they looked very different than the Ammonites at the time. We went through this in our class on Judaism a few weeks ago, and so if you were here for that, this will be a little bit of review for you. But the pagan people surrounding the Israelites, they acted very differently than the Israelites. And that was God's intention, was to take his people out of Abraham and give them a system we call Judaism. It was the Mosaic Law, and they were supposed to be entirely different from all of the pagan neighbors, all of the Gentiles around the Israelites. They were to be different on every level. It was to cross every platform of life. They were to be different. And so God said, I want you to even mourn differently. When pagan people lost someone or went through great mourning, they would rend their clothes. They would often sit in sackcloth and ashes. They would shave their head. They would do different things that would involve cutting. That would involve shaving portions of their head. Now, this is, from what I can tell biblically, pretty universal. Job, who was, we think, before or near the time of Abraham, but he was not a Jewish man. He did not come from the loins of Abraham. Do you recall what Job did when his sons and daughters died? All of them died. He got wind of that. What did he do? He rent his mantle, and the Bible says he shaved his head. Now, this is foreign to us in the Western cultures because when we lose a loved one, our instinct, our rituals are not to shave portions of our head. It's not to do things to our clothes. We do things very differently. We get flowers. We get cards. We spend time with family. We have a service. And we do things that are not nearly as emotional, nearly as ritualistic, nearly as intense. But at the time in which Judaism was implemented, that's what they did. Now, God said to the Jewish people in two places in the law. In one place, in Leviticus, he said, Ye shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard. Ye shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord. We often just assume that verse has to do with, our everyday activities, if you were to apply that to the Christian, which you shouldn't, but that's what we might assume. But that has everything to do with mourning. God did not want his people to mourn the same way the pagan people did. Think about it. When we die, when our loved ones die, it is perhaps the most spiritually sensitive time of our lives, is it not? People who have no interest in God all of a sudden wake up when they lose a loved one and say, I'm going to see him someday. I'm just so glad that grandma or grandpa or whoever it is with God now, and I can't wait someday. They're better off. And, well, this is the first time we've heard about God in your whole life. Because death has a way of waking us up to our mortality and also opening our eyes to eternity and to spiritual things. So mourning for a pagan person really ramps up paganism, idolatry. False gods are a big part of pagan rituals. And so God says, you're not going to be like them. You're going to be different. You're not going to shave any portion of your head, including the round spots. You're not going to cut yourself anywhere. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, God said, Ye are the children of the Lord your God. Ye shall not cut yourselves, nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. He says, For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God, and the Lord hath chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto himself. So what the pagans evidently would do is they would take portions of their head and their forehead and their eyebrows, shave it, cut it, and make markings for the loved ones they have just lost. God said, you're not going to do that. I want everyone to know you're different. I want everyone to know you're not like them. You say, why? Just to be different for the sake of being different? No, because you are the mediator, if you would. You're the light that points everyone to the true God. The world needs to know that the God of Israel is the true God. So you're going to be peculiar. You're going to be different. You're not going to live the way they live. You're not going to worship the way they worship. You're not going to mourn the way they mourn. So that's the context. Fast forward to 2 Samuel 10, David says, hey, I want to show kindness to Hanun. He lost his father, difficult time. All right, boys, go and comfort David. Take some Hanun, take some flowers, take a card for me. Let him know that I'm seeking his blessing, and I'm hoping that he is comforted. So these Jewish men show up. Full beard. Full set of hair. Their clothes are all intact. There's no blood dripping from their face, no blood dripping from their arms. They look like they could care less in the eyes of a pagan. When they show up in Ammon, the princes are sitting around. The whole city most likely is sitting around mourning, sackcloth and ashes, shaving their head, their beard, cutting themselves. Their clothes are torn. Why? Because they're mourning, they're grieving. And in come the Jewish men. We're here to comfort you. Well, these Ammonites look at them and say, comfort. You don't look like you're here to comfort us. You don't seem at all like you're mourning like we're mourning. And they drew a conclusion based on the differences between the societies, the cultures. Because the Ammonites were defensive first, they interpreted the appearance of the Israelite men as void of any sincere mourning. And so the Ammonites interpreted those differences in mourning disastrously. Because they didn't look like us, the Ammonites assigned a bad motive. Because they didn't act like us, the Ammonites said they must be here to spy and overthrow our city. Many of us are defensive. In fact, I would argue all of us are defensive people. It's just a matter of what level. We're all defensive to some level. Defensive people assume the worst in people, which is nature. They're protecting themselves, so they assume the worst in people. Defensive people interpret differences as dangerous. And when we see the worst in others, we will be inadequate to interpret differences properly. We'll look at different styles, different languages, different approaches, different personalities, and we will assume because they're different, because they look different than what I would look like in that situation, they must have something wrong with them. There must be something evil about them. Assuming the worst in people strips us of the ability to investigate and understand differences. It robs us of the opportunity to learn about the differences between individuals. And this is a big problem in marriage. Why? Because a marriage is one man and one woman. One man and one woman. Very different individuals. By gender, men and women are very different. So men will look at a woman and see the way they act, see the way they sound, see the way they respond, and because it's not like them, they'll assume the worst. And women certainly do the same thing. They look at a man, he doesn't act, sound, look, act in any way like a woman, so she's, well, something must be wrong with him. He's out to get me. She's out to get me. It poses a tremendous relationship problem. And so I have to remind us all, just because someone is not like you, A, doesn't make them wrong, and B, doesn't mean they're out to get you. Just because someone doesn't talk to you like you would talk to them doesn't make them wrong, and secondly, doesn't make them out to get you. Just because someone doesn't approach life the same way you do doesn't mean they're out to get you. If you're going to assign a motive to someone, you've got to be able to interpret the differences between you and that person properly. So before assuming the worst, ask first. That's what I want you to remember tonight. Before assuming the worst, ask first. Now, when you ask questions, don't ask accusatorily. What were you thinking that you did that? Well, that's not a question. That's an accusation. You need to ask sincerely, hey, what was on your mind when you did that? What's your intention? I'm just trying to figure you out a little bit because it just seems a little off to me. I don't know how to interpret this. So just if you could explain yourself to me a little bit. Get to know them. Ask them. These Ammonites didn't even ask David's servants, hey, what are you here for? You say you're mourning, but you don't look like us. What's the deal? They just assumed right away. And that was a problem. Let's look at verse number 4. And secondly, when we assume the worst, we will be initiating disrespect. Verse number 4, wherefore Hanun took David's servants and shaved off the one half of their beards and cut off their garments in the middle, even to their buttocks, and sent them away. Verse 5, when they told it unto David, he sent to meet them, because the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, tarry at Jericho until your beards be grown, and then return. I hope what we just discussed about Old Testament Judaism has enlightened you regarding this strange approach of the Ammonites. For many years, you may have read this and said, that was just a weird way of humbling these guys. I mean, why shave? There's a lot of things we can do today to make someone pay the price for threatening us. Why shave off half of a beard and then cut their clothes the way they did and send them back? That didn't seem real smart. In fact, anyone would know this isn't going to be received well by the Israelites, but they did it still. And why did they do that? Well, think about it. They saw these two Jewish men coming to comfort the Ammonites. The Ammonites were not in any way convinced of that, based entirely on the way they looked, and said, oh, you're here to comfort us, are you? We don't buy it. Let's show you what it really looks like to be a comforter. And so they shaved off some of their beard, and they cut their clothes and sent them back. And you might think this was humiliation to these men because of their masculinity. But they were ashamed not because of their masculinity. They were ashamed because of their faith, because of their religion. They left Israel at the order of their king to go introduce some level of comfort to the Ammonites. They come back into the land of Israel looking like a pagan person, mourning. It was a shame to them. Not embarrassment. It was a shame to them because these people were devoutly Jewish, worshiping the Hebrew God, who gave strict orders not to do that, and someone else made them look that way. It was a shame to them. It was a shame to them. The point being here is, because the Ammonites assumed the worst of David's men, they felt justified disrespecting them at a high level. And this is a part of human nature that we need to come to grips with. It's this automatic instinct in relationships that when we feel someone is a threat to us, we instantaneously and immediately go into battle mode and we justify it. In other words, if I think Smaz is opposed to me, he presents a threat to me, immediately we go into survival mode, and I can now do to him whatever I want, and it's justified because he started it. He started it based on what? My assumptions. Right? I assumed he has an issue with me when I haven't figured out by fact that he does indeed have that. When husbands assume the worst about their wives, or when wives assume the worst of their husbands, both genders justify treating the other disrespectfully. Siblings do this. Even parents do this. Even parents, when they look at their children and assume that their children are out to disobey or disrespect them, justify bringing the hammer down on them unjustly, without any evidence of disobedience. If you want to write a quote down, write this down. Assuming the worst in someone is a private and silent declaration of relationship war. Assuming the worst of someone is a private and silent declaration of relationship war. Not you to them, as much as you internally have already said, they're out to get me, and now I can justify disrespecting them in some way. When we feel we have an enemy, we go into survival mode, and survival mode is never, capital N-E-V-E-R, love mode. Just never. Never do we say, ooh, that person's out to get me. I'm just going to love them to smithereens. We don't do that instinctively. The only time we do that is if we feel God really pressing us to do that. But it's our nature to go into everything but love mode. We go into offensive mode even. This story of 2 Samuel 10 must be a vivid reminder of the dangers associated with assuming the worst. You know, David's true motive was identified in the text for us. We have the advantage of God telling us what David's heart was. His true motive was to help Hanan. Somehow, some way, Hanan interpreted David's motive to hurt him. Think about that. David was fully invested on being a blessing, but Hanan interpreted it as David being a problem, and Hanan disrespected the man who was intending on helping him. Ladies, you cannot afford to assume the worst about your husband because he may be truly intending to help you. And I can tell you that when a wife disrespects her husband when his intent was truly to help her, it does massive amount of damage to that marriage. It's hard enough to get a guy to want to be a blessing because he's very single-tracked. He's just, I'm working, I'm doing what I got to do. But when he stops and says, I'll go and get some flowers for my wife and be a help to her with no provocation, and he comes home and gives flowers, and you say, what did you do now? That's not good. But see, there's an assumption there without investigating, without inquiring. I mean, look at the credit card bill before you accuse him of something, but do some type of investigation. But it pushes him very far away. And guys, it's no different for you. You cannot afford to assume the worst about your wife because she may be 125% behind you. If you think that she isn't, you disrespect her, it will only encourage her to not get behind you. Think about it. The last person we should ever want to disrespect is the person who is minded to help us. The last person we should ever want to hurt is the person that is intending to bless us. So rather than assuming the worst, ask first. Let's look at verse number 6. Number 3, assuming the worst not only interprets disastrously, initiates disrespect, but number 3, it incites discord. Verse number 6, and when the children of Ammon saw that they stank before David, the children of Ammon sent and hired the Syrians of Beth-Rahab and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 footmen, and of King Maacah 1,000 men, and of Ishtab 12,000 men. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. And the children of Ammon came out and put the battle in array at the entering of the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah and of Rehab and Ishtab and Maacah were by themselves in the field. When Joab saw that the front of the battle was against him before and behind, he chose of all the choice men of Israel and put them in array against the Syrians. And the rest of the people he delivered into the hand of Abishai his brother, that he might put them in array against the children of Ammon. And he said, if the Syrians be too strong for me, then thou shalt help me. But if the children of Ammon be too strong for thee, then I will come and help thee. Be of good courage, and let us play the men for our people, and for the cities of our God. And the Lord do that which seemeth him good. What a tragic mistake Hanan and his servants made. Right? At the beginning of this passage, Hanan had an alliance with David, the greatest champion in the Middle East, the giant killer. He had the greatest support in David. But because they assumed the worst of David's intentions to comfort Hanan, they turned their greatest ally into their greatest enemy. They made a faithful friend into a devout foe. And so assuming the worst in any relationship will make you stink before them. I don't know how many of you have experienced this, probably most of you. But is there anything more offensive than someone telling you what your motive is? Have you ever had that happen? Where someone says, you wanted to do that. And you respond, no, I didn't. Yes, you did. Whoa, I didn't know you have a portal to my soul. Thank you very much for telling me what I don't know. But when that happens, there may be nothing more offensive, nothing more insightful for discord. There is this natural instinct of, how dare you? You think you know this better than I know this? You think you know this better than I know this? Then why am I bothered talking to you? And so the argument ensues, right? This is the problem Hanan had with David. Now, we do this with people, and unfortunately, we do this with our spouses, with our parents, with our children, with our siblings. And when someone that you love assumes the worst in you, it incites discord, it creates contention. In fact, I would argue that David was more angry that Hanan accused him of wanting to hurt Hanan than he would have been if Hanan said, I'm not interested in your comfort, thank you anyways. Had Hanan just said to the servants of David, guys, not real comfortable with this, go back home, thank you so much, but we don't need you here. David would have been disappointed. Maybe David would have been offended. However, Hanan didn't just say, guys, you're not welcome here. David was told that Hanan said of his men, you're not here to comfort us. You're here to destroy us. Whoa, that's a whole different level of accusation. It's one thing to deny the help of someone else. It's an entirely different thing to accuse them of offering help in a disguise to hurt them. That will incite discord. That will destroy a relationship. Assuming the worst for Hanan provoked a giant killer. And assuming the worst in your marriage will provoke problems. I wonder how many marriages could be salvaged. How many families could be spared if we would simply stop assuming the worst in those we love the most. You should write some of this stuff down because it's a good reminder. Assign evil motives to good people, and you'll incite relationship war. Accuse good people of evil motives, and you'll incite relationship conflict. Period. It's just human nature. And I'll throw this in here before we move on to the final and brief point. But let me just remind everyone tonight, our loved ones don't have to possess bad motives to make big mistakes. Your husband may hurt you, but that doesn't mean he intended to do that. Your children may break your heart, but that doesn't mean they went out of their way to do that. It's an important point to remember because when we get hurt, we say things we shouldn't say. And when we bring motive of other people into that conversation, it does incite conflict. People are going to hurt you because they're people. It doesn't mean they intended to do that. Your children will make mistakes. Don't accuse them of being Satan incarnate with an intent to destroy everything you've ever loved. Okay? They're human beings. Amen. All right, 3 of you. So rather than assuming the worst, no, ask first. You're not paying attention. Gary, do you want to give your report now? Because I don't know if I should bother with this 4th point. All right, here it is again. Ready? Rather than assuming the worst, we're going to ask first. Okay? Got that? Okay. Rather than assuming the worst, verse number 13, number 4, assuming the worst inherits dissatisfaction, or disaffection, I'm sorry. It'll also get some dissatisfaction from other people. Verse 13, and Joab drew nigh, and the people that were with him, unto the battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And when the children of Ammon saw that the Syrians were fled, they fled also before Abishai and entered into the city. So Joab returned from the children of Ammon and came to Jerusalem. And when the Syrians saw that they were smitten before Israel, they gathered themselves together, and Hadarezer sent and brought out the Syrians that were beyond the river, And they came to Helam, and Shobak, the captain of the host of Hadarezer, went before them. And in verse 17 it says, when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and passed over Jordan and came to Helam. And the Syrians set themselves in array against David and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel. And David slew the men of 700 chariots of the Syrians and 40,000 horsemen, and smote Shobak, the captain of their host, who died there. And when all the kings that were servants to Hadarezer saw that they were smitten before Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. Look at the last phrase of the chapter. So the Syrians feared to help the children of Ammon anymore. We just read 40,000 Syrians plus the men of 700 chariots died. Why did they die? Because David sent 2 men to be a blessing to a king who assumed the worst in those 2 men, incited war. Syrians were hired to help the Ammonites because they couldn't dare go up against David's mighty men. As a result, 40,000 plus men from Syria, not Ammon, died because someone assumed the worst. What's the point here? The point is, the more you assume the worst in people, the more you drag other people into it, they will get hurt as a result, and you will lose all of your supporters. The allies that you may spend a lifetime accruing, the friends you may spend a lifetime earning, the family you may spend a lifetime securing, it can all be undone if you simply assume the worst in somebody that is a supporter of yours when you shouldn't. The Syrians would no longer help the Ammonites, and the Ammonites would live on an island at least the rest of Hanun's existence. The Ammonites assumed the worst in David, and listen, they brought upon themselves the worst of David. He offered them the best. They assumed the worst, and they provoked in David the worst. And as a result, David came at them fierce, annihilated their support, and destroyed that relationship. And you can say all you want, well, I can assume the worst in people, but they're supposed to still love me. They're supposed to turn the other cheek. And you can claim Christianity all you want for the other person, but if you assume the worst in someone, that relationship will be on fire, and the people around it will burn. You say, come on, preacher, it's just something so small. I don't know, a whole chapter in the Holy Scripture of God is dedicated to this relationship conflict. Do you think that this story is in here merely for historical context? Do I care what happened with the nation of Israel and the children of Ammon in 2 Samuel 10? Not really. But I care about what led to that conflict, so that I can help my relationships, so that I can help you in your relationships. God put this in here to teach us about relationships. Yes, it has historical context, but God wants us to say, don't do that. Don't assume the worst in somebody without getting the facts first. Now, I've got to point out for parents the danger of assuming the worst in our children. When we assume the worst in our child, I guess I should say, the other children see that, if you have multiple kids. And when the other kids see you assuming the worst in your child, when they know that kid, that's going to impact those children and your relationship with them. And what they will do naturally is withdraw themselves from you because they can't trust you if they see you treating their sibling the way you are. And it doesn't even need to be towards your child. If you're that way with your husband, your kids see it. Isn't it amazing how much children watch and observe in marriage? We think they're just glued to the TV and care less about their parents. They're fascinated with the relationship that their parents have. They're watching everything. I've always found it fascinating in our home, and I have to be careful how much to divulge, but over the years, because our kids go to public school and all these classmates of theirs are divorced, If my wife and I ever have any level of elevated arguments, and we don't, I just win all the time, but no. We're human, and if once in a while we bark at each other. But I remember a time when one of my kids would say, "Stop yelling, we don't want you to get a divorce." I don't think they just said yelling. They just said, something about a divorce right away. And you look at them and you realize, these kids are always thinking. They're fearful. All children. And I'm not in any way saying my marriage is perfect, because it's not. But our marriage is very stable. My wife and I are very close. We're cool. My kids have no reason to ever fear that right now. But see, they're always watching because of what they know with other parents. And so if you assume the worst in your husband, or if you assume the worst in your wife, your kids are watching that. And they're saying, man, why does mom know dad better than dad knows dad? Why does dad seem to always accuse mom of something that she's never done wrong? And their minds, their little minds, are now becoming fearful of mom and dad because of what they're assuming. Some of you are looking at me with eyes like, really? Absolutely. You tell me, how do you feel about someone you know who is always assuming the worst in people? The attributes you don't want to possess are being negative all the time, pessimistic all the time, paranoid all the time. You don't want to be this person that's always judging everyone else before you even get to know them. If you're that type of person, people do this. I don't want to be around that one, because I see how he is always assuming the worst of them. He'll probably do that of me too. One of the disadvantages of pastoring in the church that you were raised is you're surrounded by the friends and family you've had your whole life, and so you can't use illustrations of the church you were once in. And so I can't often share with you these anonymous details for fear of, who's he talking about in here? Who is it? But I can tell you, over the course of my young life, it's easy to pick out the people who are always assuming the worst of others. And when it happens in a church, it provokes a great deal of division and discord. And those are the people that personally I don't trust. And if I don't trust them, I don't invest in them. If I don't invest in them, they are losing the opportunity to have another friend. So when I say to you, don't assume the worst, because you will inherit disaffection, you will inherit some disapproval, you will encourage people to stay away from you, I say it based on biblical principles, but also on observation. Assuming the worst is deadly, it's dangerous to any relationship we possess. So rather than assuming the worst, thank you, Bob. You're such a blessing. Yes, rather than assuming the worst, ask first. Just have the guts and the courage to sit down with someone and say, do you not like me? What did you mean by that? You might not get the answer you want, but now you know what you're dealing with. But if you assume the answer, you may do what Hanan did with David. FYI, you know how I said this morning that no one cares about what you wear more than you? Remember that statement? Along with that lines, there are very few people, if any, in this world who are out to get you. Everyone is about themselves. You may get in the way of that. But I can say with confidence that right now there isn't a basement hideout that has pictures of you and targets all over it, okay? Sometimes we just think we're more important than we are to people. People just say things and do things that we interpret unjustly. That it would be better just to say, hey, you looked at me really swirly. Do you hate me? 9 times out of 10 they're going to say, did I even look at you? Right? You ever been there? Just have the guts to ask the question. you'll avoid yourself a lot of problems. Let's stand and have a word of prayer.